people are suffering for a political decision, for this one man wants to be a lifelong dictator in China.
Hello, let me welcome you to another edition of Forum 2000 online debate, China and what the COVID or A4 protests change. What can we learn about the communist regime's response to the COVID protests or A4 protests that was named after the blank white paper that some protesters hold during the demonstrations? And what does the reopening of China, of PRC, mean for the country, its people, and the world? As you know, protests against the zero COVID policy in China took place last year across the whole country. Experts warn that the newly third-time re-elected Secretary General Xi Jinping and the Communist Party itself face a significant threat to its power and stability. As a consequence, the CCP abandoned key parts of its stringent containment strategy, including forcing people into quarantine camps or preventing foreigners from returning to their homes. What does the CCP's response tell us about its stability and strength? To discuss what it shows, I'm going to speak with Professor Xiao Qiang, American journalist, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and also founder and co-editor or editor-in-chief of news website called China Digital Times. Professor Xiao Qiang, welcome. And I'm also going to speak with Mr. Parsifal D'Sola, founder and director of the China Latina America Research Center of Andrés Bello Foundation based in Colombia. Parsifal, pleasure having you here as well. I would like to ask probably both of you, what have been the recent developments in China after its borders opened on January 8th, on the weekend? Can you tell us about the situation there as you watch it and it unfold and cover maybe for China Digital Times? Maybe Xiao Qiang, can you start, please?
Sure. On January 8th, it's a starting date that China officially opened its border without much of the testing and the requirement, quarantine, let the Chinese nationals can travel abroad, and also let the people living outside of China, including overseas Chinese diaspora and international business and other tourists coming to China without much restriction. So officially, this 3 years of the zero COVID policy ended like that. But this is already a month past that in China, the old level of the government has relaxed the zero COVID control right after the nationwide white paper protests against such brutal and cruel policy. The control policy failed not only because it's failed in the popularity, it's ruined the economics, but also practically failed to preventing the Omicron spread in Chinese society. By the time Chinese government has to let this policy go, the matter of fact is the virus already pervasive, spread it in almost all over China. So it's a failed policy. But what the people didn't expect is how the 180-degree changed. That government didn't do anything, didn't prepare any preparation for the society to let the Chinese society to still right now undergoing this storm of virus throughout the entire population of 1.4 billion people. And this is a still unfolding tragedy in China.
You're going to talk about it, but maybe for some of our listeners, if I may ask Parsifal, if when we are mentioning the zero COVID policy, if Parsifal, could you maybe summarize its development and why actually the zero COVID policy started and how did it affect the Chinese people and their lives? Some people call it actually social and economic experiment without precedent. So do you agree? And can you tell us? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Kateřina. I guess with every other policy or decision in China, we can only guess, given the level of opacity and the black box that is Chinese decision making. That being said, if we look at it from a historical perspective, or at least for the last 3 years, if we go back to 2020, when all these restrictions got put into place, overall sentiment throughout Chinese society, especially because of the control of information, was actually the restrictions were well perceived, given what was the alternative, which was the comparison with how the West particularly handled the situation. So you saw headlines in the China Daily, in the People's Daily, how the United States was allowing people to die, wasn't taking any steps, and in contrast, the Chinese state was taking care of its people, and that's why all these policies were put into place. So let's just say the initial perception from the public in China was rather positive, given how the problem was framed from Beijing. Then, obviously, we fast forward 2-3 years, and the world has moved on. And this did not go unseen, regardless of any information controls within China. And I think especially the World Cup had an important, it was maybe the straw that broke the camel's back. This is a worldwide event, people traveling from all around without masks, mass gatherings. And at the same time, you have inside China, things that are getting worse and worse in terms of controls. And when you put all of this together, it is a demonstration that there was this growing sentiment from within Chinese society that they were fed up. And that's basically why I wouldn't say they were allowed to flourish. They flourished because it was unforeseen, it was sporadic, it was spontaneous, and it united the whole of there was sympathy from across the country, because we all know that protests are not uncommon in China. They happen every day. It's the fact that we don't hear about them is another thing, but protests, strikes, labor movements, these are common every day within China. The difference this time around is that it's not location specific, it's not sector specific, it's not issue specific. There wasn't a local government or a local official to blame for this. This was actually the whole of society going against the policy from the central government. And I think that's quite telling.
Thank you. Maybe can you slightly elaborate what happened during these A4 COVID protests? They started last November as a reaction to these tight restrictions, and took place in the big cities across the whole country. They lasted approximately 3 weeks. The reaction of the CCP was surprisingly quick and direct, but what will be the impact of this reversal in the policy, the whole 180 reversal of the COVID zero policy? Maybe at first I'd like to ask about the impact in China, to Xiao Qiang and Parsifal, that if you can mention what is going to happen maybe in the rest of the world, if you can guess what is going to expect us.
Sure, I'll say a few things about the protests and its impact inside of China. First of all, this deep discontent and suffering of the people under the zero COVID policy has been zeroing under the hook for a long time in Chinese society, particularly since last March. after Shanghai, China's biggest international city, 24 million people being locked down almost for 60 days or more. And the kind of economic damage and human suffering was tremendous. And this also happened in many other parts of China in 2022, particularly, but you less heard of. For example, Tibet was under the lockdown for more than 2 months. Xinjiang, which is another ethnic group region, under the lock for more than 2 months, and many other smaller cities or regions across China. Almost half of China's population had gone through something like this. In that background, there's a huge political factor on top of this public policy, health policy, which is Xi Jinping, in order to secure his power and to get his third term of the party secretary in October, he doesn't want to change anything regarding to control the society, particularly relating to this zero COVID policy. He treated this not just to control the virus, it's control the society in general and control the party as well. He actually publicly said that we cannot just calculate the economic cost about this policy. We have to calculate the political cost of it. But which means he's not really dealing with a virus. He's dealing with a very effective social control tool in order to consolidating his power, particularly at this critical moment, that party 20 Congress. Therefore, people are suffering for a political decision, for this one man wants to be a lifelong dictator in China, and the entire Chinese people have seen it. So they associate the ineffective, brutal, and very damaging policy, people suffering across the world, as a cost of this one person's political ambition and political agenda. That really a united factor of the entire China. That's why this across the nation spontaneous protest automatically has a slogan that we don't want the COVID test, we want freedom, we do not want to be slaves, we want a vote, we do not want a dictatorship. Immediately, the message became political and nationwide. That has a huge impact. I think that, among other factors, scared the Xi Jinping and the central government quite a bit. They didn't see this coming. Therefore, that's partially explained why they immediately 180-degree drop the COVID policy. But there are two more reasons for that I need to say. Another one, obviously, is even before this protest, this policy in terms of practical control of the virus is already lost its effectiveness. The virus is already everywhere else. The local Chinese government are misreporting it, lying about their numbers. The virus is already out of control. The third factor is the Chinese government was able to try to implement the zero COVID policy by quarantining everyone. They see it, they test everyone, and they try to quarantine everyone. Is they driving their own bureaucratic apparatus to the limit. The local government, out of a resource and out of a political motivation to do this, they only do it because the order gave them a real order that if they don't do this, they're going to lose their job, and they have to do it. They're basically run off their own motivation and rationale to do this. Therefore, when the thing changes, the entire sort of commander chain, the chain of command collapse. The local government officials just drop the ball. They don't want to do anything else. They're completely exhausted. Since now they don't have to misreporting their numbers or trying to pretend to control the virus, then they rather not do anything at all. This is what I see in China happened about a month ago, and actually still recovering from that disaster.
Thank you, Xiao Qiang. Maybe one more question to both of you before we are going to talk about the prediction, what is going to happen for Europe and US. actually, how is it possible that people in China could gather and express their frustration and even call Xi Jinping to step down in this environment where the internet, media, and social sites are all heavily controlled or strictly controlled? And maybe then I would like to ask, because I know that you mentioned it already, how important was the bridgeman, Peng Lifa, and the whole action? Can you tell us as well?
Sure. Yes, we cannot help to link the one lone protester in October that inspired essentially this nationwide protest, his courage and his self-sacrifice, together with his very, very well articulated message, really speaking for everybody in Chinese society. And that courage really contentious. It took about a month and a half to become everyone's slogan on the streets. But during this month and a half, it's the slogans already being shouted and spreaded and secretly through the overseas Chinese students across the world, different campuses, through the internet, and it gets back to China, to the point of when people breaking the police chains and get on the street, and his message and his courage became the inspiration naturally. Nobody organizing this. But the fact that China has the most sophisticated and restrictive internet environment and censorship and surveillance does not say it cannot reach to a limit. The limit is the people in every level really fed up and really, really angry and frustrated about this ineffective and damaging policy. And then those slogans and messages and those heroic acts of Peng Lifa a month ago really inspired people deeply inside, particularly the young people. Therefore, when people finally get on the street, naturally his slogans and this message of we don't want a dictatorship, we want a democracy, being shouted out among the crowds, and then became an anchor around the country, across the country, and actually around the world.
Thank you. Parsifal, would you agree with Professor Xiao Qiang just said, or do you have any different opinion or that you would like to share with us?
Sure. So I agree to an extent that there was an underlying frustration that was gathering momentum over the last years. And one of the interesting things about the protests themselves is that they were used as a conduit to express other concerns or other grievances that they might have. So that's the interesting nature of these protests. While COVID restrictions were the center of this, depending on where you were in China, if you were at a university campus, if you were at the laborers from companies like Foxconn or from the manufacturing industry, was yes, the COVID restrictions were the spark, were the message, but you saw other grievances being attached to that topic itself. So I think that's a different angle on how to view protests and the nature of how such a large-scale independent, spontaneous movement was able to flourish within a controlled information and controlled environment in general. So, and I would add to that it's, again, while yes, we did see a lot of messages, directed exclusively at Xi Jinping, at the CCP, I would be cautious as to draw general conclusions about the Chinese population as a whole about actually being anti-systemic. again, it's very difficult to assess. There's no, you cannot rely on public polls or anything of the sorts to actually be able to grasp how much of an anti-systemic sentiment was part of the whole conversation.
Thank you. Maybe let me now ask about the CCP propaganda and artificial intelligence. That it's empowered state surveillance mechanism in China. So how were these two, propaganda and digital Leninism, it's already used as a term, important for the Chinese Communist Party or Chinese regime at this time, and how they were used, especially during the demonstrations and afterwards?
Well, I think the whole propaganda machine plus the censorship and external propaganda, disinformation, backed by digital technology of the state, is a critical pillar of the Chinese Communist Party's control apparatus in general. Of course, you have to have the repressive apparatus like police and armies and legal system all under the Chinese Communist Party control in order to exercise violence basically anytime, at any given time, ready in order to suppress the society. But on top of that, those propaganda machines can be very, very effective in the context of social economic policies, relatively speaking, is effective and being well implemented in the society in general. If the economy is not going well, if people's life is actually suffering, well, then no matter which way you're trying to spin this thing, blaming to external enemies or making up your numbers or framing it differently, it doesn't last that long. In the end, it hurt the party itself. And this is exactly happened in China in the last 3 years. And in the first 18 months of the COVID, this very, very restrict social control methods actually was effective in terms of containing the virus at the early version. Compared with many other places in the world, Chinese economy was actually growing. That Chinese factories was able to open. So the propaganda to contribute this achievement at the time of this policy entirely to the party and to the system and to the only leader, Xi Jinping, was the message gets through to the Chinese population. People sort of buying that mainly because they see them around, even their life was being restricted and suffered a bit. But at the same time, compared with the chaotic situation in the other part, this seems like effective policy. But what's not effective is the fundamental sort of flaw of dictators, that they become their own victim when the situation changes, that when the resources should have been put into some other place, like investing in the vaccine and other approaches. They stuck with their own success at the beginning, but then to turn that into a political legitimacy argument, a piece of propaganda, the cornerstone, and they stuck with it, and using that for a political reason, cannot change and adopt the change of what's happening on the ground. So that inflexibleness, misjudgment of situation, all because of that one man that cannot hear and adjust the situation changes, in the end, bring the Chinese society a huge cost. And then the propaganda becoming a sort of the message hurting himself. And now that the new propaganda directive is forbidden the Chinese media talk about what they boasted for 3 years, so-called anti-COVID spirit of Chinese Communist Party. Because now the policy becomes so unpopular, those propaganda cannot work anymore. And the policy change 180 degrees, the propaganda cannot keep it up. Yeah, you cannot just, so they are shooting themselves in the foot. but the surveillance and control and the repressive apparatus still at working. That's why they can effectively still control the society, not further going to the further unrest. The problem is not that people can simply forget what they had gone through the 3 years, and what has failed, and what the cost the society has paid. And this reflection and painful memory, together with this deeply discontent about their country politically becoming a dictatorship and for lifelong, that they have to go. Now they are living in this sort of going backward historical situation, will become the fundamental insecurity seat, for the Xi Jinping rule in the coming years and even decade. It's not saying I'm not predicting that immediate arrest, but what I'm predicting or I'm stating is this deep political discontent and the breach of the public trust with the government policy is not going to go away. And it's creating this very fundamental insecurity of Xi Jinping's rule in the coming decade.
Thank you. Parsifal, do you think that the insecurity seed was planted and this is going to have impact on the society?
I would begin saying that authoritarian governments in general, and this is backed up by an array of academic work, are insecure in general. I don't think this is new. I think this is just the nature of the system. And authoritarian governments are even, I would say, even pay more attention than democracies do to public sentiment, because they are well aware of the power of societies, especially in a country as big, as diverse, and as complex as China is. So I think this is the status quo. It's just how authoritarian governments work in general. That being said, for changes within society to take place, I think we should do not underestimate the Chinese public in general. The protests themselves were evidence of how ingenious they are. I cannot take away my mind from the image of people. There was this person in Shanghai walking with 2 llamas. And this is reminiscent of, Ai Weiwei and the Cao Nima, the movement. And so, yes, the sentiments are there, but they do take time to manifest themselves within a controlled environment. I would say that, we will see changes. And I agree with Professor Qiang when he says that, that people remember. They will remember, those 3 years. They will remember how they felt, how the government reacted. But on the other side of the coin is that I really do not see the central government. I don't see Xi Jinping. I don't see his group of advisors as having perceived the country as having lost control. Yes, they were obviously preoccupied, and the protests were a big part of the puzzle when it comes to the decision to, lift all of the restrictions. But to argue that they lost control, that they were genuinely afraid of what could have happened if this had continued, I don't buy that argument. I think there were other factors involved as well. The economy, has been the performance factor that has, this argument that the CCP rides on the performance legitimacy, and if the economy suffers as it did because of the implementation of zero COVID, I think it was a mixture of all of it. Yes, the protests were a big part of it, but the economy was another thing. There are important, power sectors within the CCP that had to be pushing for opening up. So when you put everything in the bag, I think that yes. So that's where the decision comes from. So in the long run, I do see, especially for younger generations, the ballinghos, generations after the 80s, this, especially in urban areas, this is where potential change could come from.
Thank you. And our last question, I promise that we are going to return back to China these days. So what do you think, how this quick reopening of China, of PRC, affects both positively and negatively us here in Europe or in America? You mentioned the economy, so maybe with the impacts of the world economy and etc.
I would just simply say that it should be a good news for your economy, for Chinese economy, and for the global in general. Regardless what, China is still a main suppliers manufacturing most of the good for the world economy, and the fact that Chinese society has reopened up all the economic activities, and also the restored the travels and exchanges with abroad is a positive for economically. But I would add, because of the failed policy of zero COVID and deeply damaged Xi Jinping's credibility and actually the real control over his apparatus. I'm not saying he's losing the control of the society, but I'm saying his control over the government actually currently being weakened. He needs to find a way politically re-empower himself to back to the position, because he needs that level of the control in order to be the lifelong dictator in China. That's his only agenda. On that front, I'm afraid it's not a good news. Because I can see he will galvanize the nationalistic sentiments, and using that, creating an external issue to shift attention to reconcile power back to his hand. And by creating external issue, I mostly am afraid of Taiwan or any of those international dispute that China going to provoke. Not for the issue themselves, but it's for domestic Xi Jinping's personal political agenda.
Thank you, Xiao Qiang. Parsifal, please, would you like to add something?
Sure. Well, internationally speaking, I think it will be welcomed. And the 180-degree turn wasn't only with COVID. Is it just yesterday or 2 days ago? There were a list of reforms were announced, even to the point of lifting the blockage of importing Australian coal. There's a lot of there has been a change in tone in terms of foreign policy, of being more conciliatory especially towards Europe. And I think that from an international perspective, especially the global South, it will be perceived as positive, as especially given the ramifications of Russia's war in Ukraine. That China coming back into the global economy is actually a good thing that could contribute to economic recession and contraction within the global South.
Thank you very much. Our time fled away, but I have still so many questions, so I'm going to mail you later. But now let me thank you for your time, for your knowledge that you have shared with us. Also, thank you, our viewers, for staying with us online. Thank you and goodbye, and looking forward to see you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.